Now, this morning we talked about the connection between kindness and mercy. And we talked about how mercy is expressed through action. And in that portion of the lesson, I made a reference to a moment in David's life in which he wanted to show kindness to King Saul. And this evening, I've decided to spend a little time with David and showcase his kindness toward King Saul in the aftermath of King Saul's death. So I want you to journey with me in the life of David, in particular in those moments of the early parts of 2 Samuel in the aftermath of Saul's death, and see how David showed kindness in that period of his life. But to set us up, we need to go to 1 Samuel chapter 31. That's the last chapter of 1 Samuel. And in it we'll read how Saul died. So 1 Samuel chapter 31, starting in verse 1. Now the Philistines were fighting against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons. And the Philistines struck down Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. The battle pressed hard against Saul. And the archers found him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he feared greatly. Therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died with him. Thus Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor-bearer, and all his men on the same day together. So 1 Samuel 31 tells us about the death of King Saul. Now, if you'll turn over to the first chapter of 2 Samuel, you'll see David's reaction. But David has to first learn about Saul's death because David wasn't there. In this period of their lives, they are not working in cohesion because Saul's been trying for years to kill David. So here we are, 2 Samuel chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. After the death of Saul, when David had returned from striking down the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. And on the 3rd day, behold, a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. And when he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid homage. David said to him, "Where do you come from?" And he said to David, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." And David said to him, How did it go? Tell me." And he answered, "The people fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead, and Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." Then David said to the young man who told him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" And the young man who told him said, "By chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me, and I answered, 'Here I am.' And he said to me, 'Who are you?' I answered him, 'I am an Amalekite.' And he said to me, 'Stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers.' So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord." Saul's dead. David has just learned about it. And from this point forward, David's going to show extraordinary kindness to King Saul. First and foremost, we're going to see that David shows kindness because he grieved Saul's death. Look at David's response to this news. It comes in verses 11 and 12 of 2 Samuel chapter 1. Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son and for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel because they had fallen by the sword. David's immediate reaction is to weep, is to mourn, is to grieve. Note that David's initial reaction is not celebration. For several years at this point, Saul has been David's nemesis. Saul had been chasing him. Saul had been threatening his life. Saul had tried to kill him on multiple occasions. Saul had been the irritant in David's life, the tormentor of David's life. And yet when Saul dies, David does not celebrate. David doesn't rejoice. David doesn't throw a party. David grieves and David mourns. And I want you to notice, if you keep reading and notice verse 14, after he rips his clothes and weeps and mourns, David asks this messenger a poignant question. He said, "How is it you were not afraid to put your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" David's question calls to remembrance the thought process he had when he had the opportunity to King Saul back in the depths of that cave in 1 Samuel chapter 24 and verse 6. And instead of killing Saul, he creeps up behind him and cuts off a corner of his robe. And his explanation to his mighty men that were in the cave with him, his explanation to them as to why he didn't kill King Saul was this: "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed." And then 2 chapters later, when you get to 1 Samuel chapter 26, David gets a second opportunity to kill King Saul. And he has one of his closest confidants encouraging him to seize the opportunity. But David says to him, to Abishai, "Do not destroy him," referring to King Saul. "Do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless?" And David said, "As the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish," which we're talking about right now. Verse 11, he said, "The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed." David's thought process was always, this guy was chosen by God. I'm not going to harm him. That's not my place. I respect God's decision. I respect God's order. I respect God's will. And here he is, hearing the report of Saul's death, and he's wondering how this messenger had the audacity to contribute to the demise of Saul. Even though Saul's injured, even though Saul's dying, even though Saul's not going to necessarily recover from the injuries he sustained, even though Saul's going to be captured or killed by the Philistines, David still has such a respect for the fact that God appointed Saul to this position that he would have never contributed to his execution. See, that messenger assumed that the news of Saul's death and the bringing of that crown and that armlet would be good news to David. It might even result in a reward from David, because that was the custom of the day. But David did not perceive Saul's death as good news because he respected his status as the Lord's anointed. And look at how he chose to deal with this messenger in verse 15 and 16 of 2 Samuel chapter 1. Then David called one of the young men and said, "Go execute him." and he struck him down so that he died. And David said to him, "Your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed." And reflecting on that decision just a few chapters later, when you get over to 2 Samuel chapter 4 and verse 10, when a couple of other guys brought the head of Saul's descendant Ishbosheth, who had claimed the throne, even though David had been anointed for it. They brought the head of Saul's son Ishbosheth, thinking David's going to be glad. But David reflects on what he did when that messenger came and reported Saul's death, and he says, "As the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life out of every adversity, when one told me, 'Behold, Saul is dead,' and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him at Ziklag, which was the reward I gave him for his news." To David, it was not good news. To David, Saul's death was something to mourn. And in that there is kindness. Because despite all the things Saul had done to him, despite all the mistreatment he received at the hand of King Saul, he still respected him. In the eyes of David, he didn't necessarily view Saul as an enemy, because he still loved Saul and he still respected Saul, at least in terms of his appointment as king. So David didn't rejoice when Saul died. Instead, he grieved. And in fact, he even wrote a lament that's recorded there at the end of 2 Samuel chapter 1. And I'll read a portion of it. In verse 19, he says, "Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult." In verse 24, he adds, "You, daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle." 3 times in this short lament, David used the phrase, "how the mighty have fallen." From our vantage point, Saul was not mighty. But from the vantage point of David, Saul deserved respect and honor because he was the Lord's first anointed. See, in David's response to the news of Saul's death, we're reminded about something regarding kindness. We are reminded of a lesson we've already talked about. We are reminded that kindness extends even to one's enemies. You may recall from last Sunday how we studied Luke chapter 6, where Jesus draws a comparison between his disciples and heathens or pagans or unbelievers, those outside of his family. And he says this, "If you love those who love you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them." He's saying that even people who aren't Christians, who aren't disciples, who don't know him, who don't follow him, even people who are lost in sin, know how to be kind to someone they like. The difference is being kind to someone who's your enemy. That's how you distinguish yourself from the world. And that's what David did. In this moment, as he grieves and mourns and honors King Saul, he's showing a different kind of kindness. But it doesn't just stop here. I think another way David showed kindness to Saul is by waiting for Saul's throne. You might be able to recall that you can go back several chapters into 1 Samuel to read about David's anointment. David was anointed king as essentially a teenager, as a young man. He was anointed king in the middle of Saul's reign. And by this point in time, it was kind of common knowledge that David was supposed to be the next king. Even Saul acknowledged that at one point in time. But David didn't seize the opportunity to go take the throne. I mean, the messenger that reported Saul's death came to David expecting that. That's why he brought the crown. But David didn't assert himself as the next king right away. Look at 2 Samuel chapter 2, the first 4 verses. What does David do? David inquired of the Lord. He asked, "Shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah?" And the Lord said to him, "Go up." David said, "To which shall I go?" And the Lord said, "To Hebron." So David went up there, and his 2 wives also, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David brought up his men who were with him, everyone with his household, and they lived in the towns of Hebron. And the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And you may raise the objection, oh, wait, David did take the throne, not Saul's throne. David sought God's instruction, and God told him to go take the throne in Hebron, not the one that Saul had in Jerusalem. David was authorized to become king over one tribe, the tribe of Judah. Not the entire nation of Israel. There were 11 other tribes that did not fall under his reign initially. I find this amazing. Because what would be standard practice of an heir apparent to the throne when the predecessor is dead? If you're next in line, normally you want to get on that throne as soon as possible so you can seize control. But not David. David knows he's next. David knows that throne in Jerusalem is his. But instead of rushing to take it, he's seeking counsel from the Lord. And in so doing, he's showing kindness towards Saul and Saul's family. See, what ends up happening, while David assumes the throne in a different town over a single tribe, verses 8 through 11 of 2 Samuel chapter 2 tell us that Abner, the commander of Saul's army, who did not die in battle, took Saul's son Ishbosheth and made him king over all the other tribes of Israel. Abner made sure that the lineage of kingship stayed in Saul's family. And David didn't fight it. David didn't get upset. He didn't complain. He didn't pout. He didn't argue with God or with man. He didn't cry foul. He just patiently waited for God's timing. 7.5 years he will wait for that timing. 7.5 years he will reign in Hebron over just the tribe of Judah. And the fact that David didn't rush to take the throne in Jerusalem teaches us that kindness can be communicated through patience. I don't know if you've noticed this in our Fruits of the Spirit's investigation thus far, but kindness and patience are actually commonly linked together. Kindness is the fruit of the Spirit that immediately follows patience. You may have picked up on that already. But did you also know that the Bible's so-called definition of love begins by saying love is what? Patient and kind. Back to back again. Paul lists the qualities that God's chosen ones are to put on in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 12. And it includes both kindness and patience. When Paul described the characteristics of the Lord's servant to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 24, he said that the Lord's servant must be kind to everyone and patiently endure evil. And Paul even described God as both kind and patient in Romans 2, chapter 2 and verse 4, when he rhetorically asked, "Do you presume on the riches of His kindness and forbearance and patience, not knowing that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance?" For some reason, kindness and patience are linked together frequently throughout the Bible. And I think that reason is because sometimes we can communicate patience through kindness, and at other times we can communicate kindness through patience. Sometimes the best way for us to show our kindness to someone is by waiting, by not rushing something that shouldn't be rushed, by not forcing our selfish timetable on someone else. Sometimes kindness can be expressed through our own expression of patience. You remember when we talked about forbearance in the patience series? That comes into play here. And so David is actually communicating kindness by being patient, by waiting for his time instead of seizing an opportunity that God didn't intend for him to seize just yet. There's something for us to learn from David here about expressing kindness through waiting, through patience. And now if we skip ahead in 2 Samuel to the 9th chapter, we'll discover that David showed kindness to Saul by honoring Saul's request. In 2 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 1, David asked his servants, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" This is the verse I quoted this morning as we talked about how kindness and mercy, which go hand in hand, are evidenced through activity. David's concerned about showing kindness. Now, you may know that it was common in dynasties such as Israel that when a new king took over, all the family members of the previous dynasty were executed. The way you secure your throne is by killing off any of the heirs of the previous throne's holder. This happened throughout the Bible. This happened throughout secular history. You kill off anybody that is a competition to you. But David remembered a promise that he had made to Saul years earlier after he spared Saul's life in that cave. Going back to 1 Samuel chapter 24, when Saul was exposed to the reality of what David did, he said this to David, "You are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. And you have declared this day how you have dealt well with me, and that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. And now, behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Swear to me," verse 21, "swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house." In verse 22, we're told that David swore this to Saul. So David made a promise not to destroy Saul's heritage, not to kill all of Saul's descendants. But Saul wasn't the only one to whom David made such a promise. Sometime earlier, as recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 20, David went to Jonathan to find out why Saul, Jonathan's dad, was trying to kill him. Jonathan didn't think his dad would actually be trying to kill him at this point in time, but David persisted. So Jonathan made arrangements for David to hide in a field while he observed his father's behavior. And now listen to the words that Jonathan spoke that day as he laid out their plans in 1 Samuel chapter 20, verses 12 through 15 or so. Jonathan said, "The Lord, the God of Israel, be witness. When I have sounded out my father about this time tomorrow or the third day, behold, if he is well disposed toward David, shall I not then send and disclose it to you? But should it please my father to do you harm, the Lord do so to Jonathan and more also if I do not disclose it to you and send you away, that you may go in safety. May the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. If I am still alive, show me the steadfast love of the Lord that I may not die. And do not cut off your steadfast love." You know what the Hebrew word there is? It's that same word we talked about this morning that could be translated kindness or mercy. Do not cut off your kindness. Do not cut off your mercy from my house forever, when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. Jonathan is making a request of David that when David becomes king, because Jonathan believes it, Jonathan believes that David is the next one, even though Jonathan technically should be the next one. He asks David to make a promise not to kill all of his lineage. And David agreed to it. David agreed to show continual kindness to Jonathan's descendants when he became king. And David was intent on keeping his word, both to Saul and to Jonathan. So David here in 2 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 1, when he asks his servants, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" And so David's pursuit of someone from the house of Saul to show kindness to for Jonathan's sake reveals that keeping our word is another act of kindness. Another way we show kindness to other people is by speaking the truth and keeping our word. You know, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount spoke about the importance of keeping our words. In Matthew chapter 5, he said, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn.' But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil." Now, the issue here isn't so much the use of oaths. What Jesus is ultimately saying is that there's a problem with the way people take oaths. They try to choose creatively what they're going to swear by so that they might not have to fulfill the oath they make. If I swear by this particular thing, I have to keep it. If I swear by the throne of God, I got to keep that oath. But if I swear by the earth, I don't have to keep that one. Trickery is the name of the game with oaths. But Jesus said you should be someone whose word is so honest that you never need to take an oath. You should keep your word so well that a simple yes or no is all that needs to be said and people can trust it. See, a kindness that we offer is also our integrity. It's kindness to do what you say you're going to do. It's kindness to never have to be questioned about whether or not you're going to follow through. It's a kindness to keep your word. And David here is doing just that for Saul and for Jonathan. And if we continue down this storyline, not only is David demonstrating kindness by honoring Saul's request, but he's demonstrating kindness by blessing Saul's family. See, David's request to find someone from Saul's lineage, and particularly Jonathan's household, to whom he could show kindness, led him to a former servant of Saul named Ziba. When David asked Ziba, "Is there not still someone of the house of Saul that I may show kindness of God to him?" Ziba responded, "There is still a son of Jonathan, but he is crippled in his feet." Now, there are two things that strike me about this conversation. First, David asked in verse 1, which he asked, "Is there anybody?" And then when he got with Ziba, he asked, "Is there someone?" Anybody and someone. The use of those terms are open-ended, meaning they lack any sort of specific qualifications or parameters. In other words, David did not ask, "Is there anyone worthy?" Nor did he ask, "Is there someone important?" He's not qualifying his request. He's not identifying who can be and who can't be a target of his request. The second thing that stands out to me is Ziba's response. He responded by emphasizing the disability of Jonathan's descendant. You know, David didn't ask about the condition of Jonathan's heir, but Ziba felt it was worth mentioning. Why? I think maybe Ziba felt the need to mention the physical state of Jonathan's son in order to let David know that this guy won't be able to reciprocate whatever kindness David shows to him. But remember, David's request posed no conditions. And David's response completely ignores the concerns of Ziba, because David simply said, "Where is he?" David didn't ask about the disability or ask if there was another candidate. He wanted this guy. And there are a couple things we know about Jonathan's son. We know his name will be Mephibosheth, but we know that he's living in an area called Lo Debar. In Hebrew, Lo means no, and Debar means pasture. So Mephibosheth lived in the land called no pasture. In other words, he lived in a place that was desolate and barren. He's the grandson of King Saul. So when Saul and Jonathan died in battle, he was a potential heir to the throne. But he was relocated to a desolate place in hopes that nobody would try to take him out. Remember, in the aftermath of Saul's death, David is made king in Hebron, and one of Saul's sons, Ishbosheth, was made king in Jerusalem. To both of those kings, Mephibosheth would be a threat. He would be a threat to David because the technical lineage of the kingship, the royal line, was affiliated with Saul, with whom Mephibosheth was the grandson. But he would also be a threat to Ishbosheth, because the next in line in the eyes of Saul was Jonathan. And now that Jonathan's dead, the next in line should technically be Jonathan's grandson, right? And so it appears that that Mephibosheth was moved to this desolate region in order to avoid his own execution. The other thing we know about Mephibosheth is his disability. If you turn over to 2 Samuel chapter 4, I don't have this on the screen, but in verse 4, we are informed that he was crippled in his feet. It happened when he was 5 years old, and Saul and Jonathan had been killed in battle. And when that news came about, his nurse picked him up and fled, knowing that he would be in danger. She got him out of there, but in the process, she dropped him while running away, and that led to his crippled feet. These details about Mephibosheth, the fact that he is lame, and the fact that he's in a desolate region, they reveal his inability to return the favor to David. He's probably living in poverty, even though he's the descendant of a king. And he's physically disabled. But that didn't stop David from showing kindness to him. Because David didn't base his actions on the ability of the recipient to reciprocate. And David's desire to show kindness to Mephibosheth reinforces the lesson from this morning. The lesson that kindness shows mercy. That kindness acts mercifully. That kindness is an active demonstration of mercy towards someone else. Look at what David did for Mephibosheth according to verses 5 through 11 of 2 Samuel chapter 9. Then King David sent and brought Mephibosheth from the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, at Lo-debar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he answered, Behold, I am your servant. And David said to him, Do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. And I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always. If you skip to verse 9, then David called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, All that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, and shall bring in the produce, that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table. Do you realize what David just did? He restored the royal status to Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth's over there living in a desolate place, and he says, Nope, you've got all the land your granddad used to have. And you know what? I'm going to make your granddad's former servant take care of the land for you. You ain't got to lift a finger. And on top of that, you never have to worry about where your next meal's coming from, because you eat in my house from now on. And we're told that Mephibosheth relocated to Jerusalem and every day ate with King David. See, David's kindness wasn't just something he said, it was something he did. As I mentioned this morning in our study of the connection between kindness and mercy, the overarching message of the Bible is that kindness primarily demonstrates itself through actions. And David acted accordingly. You see, from the time he learns about Saul's death through the 9th chapter of the book, David is constantly showing kindness to Saul. And realize this, neither Saul nor Jonathan ever experienced the kindness of David that we just talked about. They're both dead. David wasn't so much doing these things for them. I think maybe he was really doing them for himself. Not in a selfish way. I think David's kindness towards Saul after Saul's death is about the person David was choosing to be. And it makes me think of one final passage, a passage written by David's own son in Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 17. It's there that Solomon said, A man who is kind benefits himself, but a cruel man hurts himself. Let me read that again. Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 17. A man who is kind benefits himself, but a cruel man hurts himself. See, David could not actually benefit Saul because Saul was no longer there. And David could not technically be a blessing to Jonathan because Jonathan wasn't there. But his acts of kindness could be a blessing to himself, just as ours can for us. Because kindness is the fruit we're supposed to produce. And as we talked about this morning, it's one of the expectations God has for us. This evening, as we continue our investigation of kindness, it may be that you realize you haven't been as kind as you should be. And if you need to respond to the invitation and repent of that, you're encouraged to do so. If you need help being a kinder person, this family would love to surround you and assist with that. And if you haven't benefited from the kindness of the one and only Father through the sacrifice His Son made, well, you can make that decision tonight as well by putting Him on in the waters of baptism. If you have any need to respond to the invitation this evening, we invite you to come while we stand